Hey everyone, welcome to the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast, where we help you build, run, and keep great teams. Thanks for being here. Let's dive in.
William, I have a question for you. Do you trust me?
Like for a trust fall?
Well,
I'm kind of a bigger guy. I don't know.
I don't know, but today we're talking all things trust. And so I want to hear your perspective. What does trust look like? Is it a trust fall? What does trust look like in a high-performing team?
Well, this is a big question, and I don't know that I'm the expert on it because I have played loose with trust in the past. I didn't realize trust is really fragile. You break it, and it is really hard to rebuild it. So I don't know, but what is trust? We can talk more about that in a minute. But what is trust? I think, the word that comes to mind is credibility.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean never messes up. It doesn't mean, always going to be absolutely what you expect.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the truth. If you're a leader and you're leading your team, you're like, some of my people are letting me down. Everyone will let you down sooner or later. Just ask Jesus.
Yeah.
He did not hire the 12 disciples based on their credibility.
Mm-hmm.
Tax collector, failed fisherman.
Yeah.
Like two brothers that wanted to be at his right hand and his left. This was not a credible team. But why do I pick the word credible? I'm a bit of a language geek. Credible goes back to the old Latin root of your creed, your credo.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, like the Apostles' Creed was the credo. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Trust becomes believability.
Okay.
And that's such an interesting lesson that I didn't get as a young leader. I thought trust was perfection. It's not. Trust is believability. I was sitting with a young leader recently who went through a really hard time in her life, and I had to tell her church about it. And she called a pastor that everyone would know, but I'm going to leave the names out. And he's just one of the wisest guys I know. And he told her, your church will forgive you as long as you tell them the truth. They can handle a mess up, but they can't handle not being able to believe you.
Yeah.
Boy, I wish I'd have learned that in seminary, because I messed up things before, and you try and gloss over them, or you try and say, oh, look over there, or you try and spin it this way or that. And it just leads down a very fast hill of people going from, I think they're credible, to, I don't know, and they're talking a little too fast. And man, once you stop believing in somebody, once you think they're no longer credible, it's really hard to get back up that hill. So for me, trust in any team goes back to believability and not perfection.
Yeah. What are some of the positive effects, and even just the collaboration that goes on within a team when team members are able to trust not only the senior leader, but those around them as well?
Yeah, well, I think, here in Texas, it's really interesting. Texas was basically founded by criminals and debtors.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that,
True.
it's kind of like Australia was a jail to start.
Yeah.
The same sort of thing, just on a different scale. But here in Texas, the term, you just need to shoot straight with me.
Yep.
That's so key. And I'm learning over time, if you need to tell people you screwed up, that's far better than trying to make them look the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And losing trust is not always just lying to people. It's not being willing to own you're part of a mistake.
That's great.
Right? So when trust is put in place, man, the sky's the limit. If it's, you talk to my son, went to Texas A&M. I went to Wake Forest undergrad, and we didn't know anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
And we just did a podcast on culture, and we didn't even mention Texas A&M, which is the biggest culture in the country. But their whole deal is shoot straight.
Yep.
Tell it like it is. Honor, duty.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean perfection. Doesn't mean be perfect. It means just be honest. And they come together in a way that he was in the Corps of Cadets,
Yep.
which is crazy. He
Mhm.
parachuted in not knowing anybody or anything about it. And those young women and men, like, they trust each other, not
Yeah.
because they're perfect, but because they got each other's back, and you're going to do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. When that happens in a team, it kind of goes back to, we were talking about high performers in a podcast some time back. And I mentioned that we've got 7 kids. They're all going in different directions for their careers. We've got 1 at home. The rest of them are 2 in college and the rest on their way. And they couldn't be going in more different directions. But they've all asked advice. And Adrian and I have tried to tell them, here, you want to succeed, then do whatever business you go into. If you do what you say you're going to do, when you say you're going to do it, at the price that you promised you will do it, you're going to be in the top, I used to say 10% of businesses in your sector. And the more I tell that story to corporate settings, the CEOs consistently pull me aside and say, it's not 10%, it's like 1%.
Yeah.
If you've ever built anything in a home, I don't think the home builders I've worked with have lied to me intentionally, but they didn't finish on time. They didn't finish on budget. And sometimes the quality wasn't what it was supposed to be. And, if you can just deliver on what you said you're going to do, then, and if it's not going to happen, own up to it right away. You'll engender trust. I think about it as a capital campaign for a church. We're going to raise whatever the number is, $20 million, $5 million, $100 million. If you're not hitting the mark, the smartest thing you can do is go back to the congregation and say, we're not hitting the mark.
Yeah.
I missed that one. I bet you end up hitting the mark. Once you own up to and just say, here's what actually happened. It's not in our wiring, though. I mean, I think sometimes people equate, well, you broke trust with you lied. Sometimes breaking trust is just not owning your part of things. Think back to the beginning of the first, scene of sin in the Bible. You can have anything you want, just not this fruit.
Yep.
That wouldn't have bothered me if it had been, you can't have the latest device from Apple.
Yeah.
Then I would have fallen immediately, but the apple itself, whatever. But so, Lord finds him in the garden. It's like, what happened here? And Adam's first one to talk. He says, well, that woman, the one you gave me, she made me do it. That's not owning anything, and it's a breach of trust.
Yeah.
People think breach of trust is a direct lie. I don't think people directly lie very often. The breaches of trust are much more subtle. It's owning your stuff. And then Eve, of course, says, well, the serpent maybe do it. And people just don't own their stuff. I can't tell you, well, I'll flip it. I can tell you that after interviewing countless candidates, I can count on 2 hands the number of times a candidate has said to me, I got fired from that job and it was my fault. Like the victim mentality, well, let me tell you what they did. Let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you what, it's so prevalent.
Yeah.
And I'm not throwing stones here. I'm actually getting you an opportunity to shine, because if you will just own your part of the problem, well, immediately you're going to stand out of the crowd, and you'll also find yourself in a better spot. I mean, I heard from counselors about divorce for many, many years. And one of the best pieces of advice I heard was, you will not heal from divorce until you figure out what part of it was your problem and you created and own that. And I know that sounds a little off from credibility and trust, but I think some people think trust is he got up and lied to us. That happens, but it's pretty uncommon. Most of the time, breaches of trust are a deflection, just not owning things and not being, what he said is exactly what happened.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned even the home builders, saying we're going to get this date and then not meeting that date, saying we're going to need this much budget and then going a little bit over. A word that kind of came to mind when you were speaking about all of that is accountability. And I just wanted to hear your insights on the differences between having accountability in a team versus micromanaging and being maybe a little bit too hands-on with team members.
Yeah, that is such a balance. I've not been around a successful church planter that doesn't know every detail in the church, even when it's huge.
Yeah.
I remember I was walking years ago with Bill Hybels in Willow Creek, and the church is huge, and they've got this big, he's got all this staff working for hundreds and hundreds of people. He's in the middle of talking about something really important as we're walking down the hall, and he stops what he's doing and goes over to a trash can and notices there isn't a liner in it. Why isn't that way?
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason the church grew to what it was.
Yeah.
He was that aware of, we got a client, I won't out them, but we had to sit down with the senior pastor and say, the church is 10,000 people now. You do not need to be putting the signs out for where the parking is on Sunday.
Yeah.
It's time to let it go, right? So I think, especially if you planted your organization, I know I feel that way as the guy who founded this place. I get a little antsy about little tiny details. That's probably a little too much, but it's because I was there when it was all on me.
Yeah.
However, just saying, people will get it right. We don't need to have any weekly one-on-ones. We don't need to have annual reviews. We'll all just get it done right. No, go read Lord of the Flies. And when there's no accountability, we as humans are not great at self-governing.
Yeah.
So it's a balance of where do you, and so I'd ask yourself, did I found this place? And so am I a little too tied to the details? Has it grown bigger than when I got here? That tends to lead to micromanaging. But on the flip side, are you really doing annual reviews? Are you really measuring whether people are doing what they say they are going to do? Very few churches I know do that. And it just leads to a big mess. And where I see it a lot is in hiring.
Okay.
In hiring, pastors get so excited about trying to tell people to come join the team that they give a very Pollyannish view of what's going on.
Yeah.
And I remember a church I interviewed with when I was pastoring, and it's not a church I went to, so I won't, don't go look up where I served and figure out what I'm talking about. That's not it. But they were telling me how great their children's ministry was, how they had all these young families. And they were moving, and so they showed me the plans for the new building. They had not put a playground in the plans. And I'm like, where are the children going to play? Oh, well, come to find out, there were very few children. Yeah. So it's this, I got to sell them on getting onto the team. And then when they get there, it's like, I've told you this and everybody around here, our job, whether we're talking to candidates while we're helping them discern their next call, or clients who are saying, help us find that next key staff member. Our job is to make sure nobody walks down the aisle with Rachel and wakes up next to Leah. Yeah. I mean, that's it's one of the best verses in all the Old Testament. And Jacob woke up and it was Leah. It's like, that's the G-rated version of whatever happens. Like, oh my gosh. It happens in hiring. And if you hire that way, you've already lost credibility even before the person joins the staff. So I'm not trying to pick on pastors. I'm the worst. I'm still having to learn. We talked an episode or two ago. I talk too fast and move too fast sometimes. And that sometimes erodes trust. So, don't paint the picture better than it is. Don't spin it better than it is. I've done all of these things so many times. I'm having learned to just back off and let things be told as they really are. In a way that you want to interview here now, we actually tell people, okay, let me tell you a few reasons why you might not want to come here.
Yeah.
Here's a few reasons why you might not like it here, because this is how we behave. And hopefully it gives an honest view, or people wake up and, oh, it's Rachel. It's not Leah.
That's right. One of the things that you mentioned, even when you were talking about year-end reviews and weekly one-on-ones, is just this kind of topic of feedback. And what are just some of the tips and maybe best practices that you've seen in teams of how to effectively give feedback, and even sometimes how to, maybe take a little bit of positive feedback and how to better your team?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is clear boundaries on why we're meeting. We're here to talk about your performance.
Yep.
We're not here to talk about whether I like you.
Yep.
We're not here to talk about whether Jesus loves you. We're here to talk about your performance. Now, in a performance review, we could do a whole podcast on it, but I think it starts with some relational. Before we get into your performance review, how's your family?
Yeah.
How are you doing with X, Y, and Z? Some relational something that builds some equity, right? And then when the performance, we're here to talk about your performance. Let's talk about what I'm really pleased with so far.
Yeah.
And it helps if you listen to our goal setting podcasts, if you can say, we set these 3 goals for you this year,
Mm-hmm.
and you got these 3 done. But always start with the positive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you don't get to the negative, you're not helping.
Yeah.
We had a situation years ago where somebody just was not making it.
Mm-hmm.
And their supervisor, they weren't a bad person. It was just their life had changed. Our work had grown immensely, and they weren't making it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, there's no villain here. It just, our work is way too important to just kind of mosey through it.
That's right.
We're helping churches determine staff. I got to have a sit down with Jesus about what I'm doing with this chessboard.
Yeah.
And it's coming one day.
Yeah.
I want it to be a good conversation. So if somebody's not making it, the kindest thing you can do is be honest with them. But their supervisor was like a pastoral care pastor almost, who's like,
Yeah.
we all love you. We think you're great at this. We think you're great at that. Maybe you can improve a little bit here, but that isn't clarity. Is kindness.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean you have to be mean. It doesn't give you a right to say, well, I'm not real strong in the gift of mercy. Nobody gets to say that, right?
Yeah.
However, clarity is kindness. If you've got someone underperforming, they need to hear it. They need to hear it in a contained conversation. We need to talk about your performance, and they need to hear it in a way that is honest.
Mm-hmm.
You will lose trust with the rest of your staff.
Yeah.
If you won't be honest with the one that's underperforming.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody listening to this podcast right now or watching it, everyone has someone that's working just hard enough to not get fired. And nobody wants to go talk to them. It's usually like, I'm going to get in so much trouble, Jared, but it's usually like the missions pastor. So it's like, here's a club, go beat the baby seal. I love missions. I'm not against missions, but my point is, it's usually somebody that you just can't. How do I tell the 94-year-old pastoral care guy that he needs, it's usually really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully nobody goes into ministry because they just love hard-nosed business.
Yeah.
Usually it's people who love people, and the last thing you want to, but clarity is kindness, and clarity will build trust with that individual
Mm-hmm.
and trust with the organization. It just needs to be in a very contained environment. Hey, we're going to sit down. We're going to talk about your performance. Before we do that, how's your family? How's this going? And let me start with, here's some things you're doing great. Now let's talk about the rest.
Yep. I love that. Is there any tips that you would give to leaders for maybe even rewarding or recognizing accountability in maybe they're from their manager level that are doing it below, but also, to a peer-to-peer level, to saying, hey, we a peer-to-peer maybe correction or maybe encouragement of accountability when going to achieve a goal?
Yeah, we've got a client. I'm not the best at this, but we've got a client years ago who one of their staff values, and I guess it's cultural, is we tell the last 10% of the truth. And this is in the deep South where, I grew up in the South, not the super deep South, but I can't tell you how many times I heard my mother say, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. And it happens in churches where, particularly in the deep South, where you never really talk about the ugly thing.
Yeah.
This church said, we tell the last 10% of the truth. And they would value when they saw someone do that. Now, that doesn't mean in an all-staff meeting you stand up and say, Jared, Ohio State's a crooked organization and they shouldn't have won the national championship and you are dirt for cheering for them. Like, that's not the last 10% of the truth.
That's right. And it'd be lies too. That would not be good.
Now we're back to the trust thing.
Oh, no.
No, I think it's not just that you reward people who are doing accountability. It's that you reward the way they're doing that accountability.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole Matthew 18 thing. You pull people off one-on-one if there's a conflict.
Yeah.
And you try and deal with it there first.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need a loudmouth running around telling people, you ought to be doing this and you ought to be. That's not valuing accountability. That's just beating people up. There's a kind way to talk to people. Just think of it like your kid. You wouldn't, completely just go after your kid in a public setting or in front of their friends, but you sure will when it's one-on-one time.
Yeah.
How accountability is done is probably just as important as that it's done. And then if you're in a setting where accountability is not a normal thing, making it a value is a huge deal. We've got a church in the south side of Chicago, fabulous people, but they don't need to make that a value because they're like, dudes. They're going to go ahead and say it like it is no matter what. So, yeah.
That's great. Would you give any last minute tips as we're closing today for team leaders as they can go and try to improve trust and accountability and credibility amongst their team?
You just do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
Do it when you say you're going to do it, and do it at the price that you promised. You do those three things, you will rise to the top. And if you'll set that pace at the top, you don't have to be perfect. When you mess up, tell people. Trust is not about perfection. Trust is just about telling it like it is. I'm still learning this. I am not the expert on this, so please don't hear this as William is the trust expert. It's an ongoing journey for all of us. None of us are perfect. I mean, Jesus just has the most fascinating taste in brides. It's amazing that he cares about us at all, because none of us have this trust. But I'm trying to learn, and I think the big lesson for me is trust isn't perfection. It's just being honest.
Yep, that's great. Well, here's what I know is that if you are able to grow trust and credibility and accountability in your team, you'll be able to achieve all that God has for you in the future.
Thanks again for joining us on the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you're looking for more leadership resources, you can find us at vanderbloemen.com and on socials at Vanderbloemen. We'll see you again next week where we continue discussing how to build, run, and keep great teams.